Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Savor Food and Body. I'm your host, Amanda Bullitt. I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor. And today I have Jenn Salib Huber. I think I got that right. I'll have Jenn correct me in a minute. She is a naturopathic doctor and registered dietitian in Canada. She's also working virtually out of Netherlands, I believe, right
Yeah.
now. And we're going to dive into so much great stuff, including like how do we navigate midlife? How do we navigate the hormonal soup, as Jenn calls it, in midlife, and our relationship with food and body. So thank you so much for being here, Jenn. It's just an honor. Like I
Yeah,
said, I've been
thanks for
following
having
your
me.
work for at least a year now. And yeah, I just think you have such great, rich information to share with folks. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
being here. So
Thank
let's
you. Thanks for having me.
absolutely. So let's dive in, if you don't mind, kind of walking us through like how you got started in this work, and even as a naturopath, and then as a dietitian, or which came first, and how you
Yeah.
started to land on focusing on this specific population of us midlife gals.
So I'm a fellow midlife gal. I'm about to turn 44 and knocking on menopause's door for sure. But yeah, so I've been a dietitian for 21 years now and naturopath for 17 and change. And the two kind of really one led into the other for me. So dietitian first, but it was while I was studying nutrition that I kind of stumbled on naturopathic medicine and decided that I wanted to do both. So did that and had a really what I would call like a general family practice for quite a few years, probably more than a decade. That was very inclusive of women in all the reproductive ages, kind of all the ages and stages, from getting pregnant to staying pregnant and postpartum. And then when I kind of hit my mid 30s, I was one of those women that really went into perimenopause quite early. And it was kind of my experience of not being able to access the kind of, I guess, even just information from even like the health professionals that I had really fantastic relationships with, because everyone assumed I was too young, and was really having a hard time kind of sorting myself out and finding people to help me sort myself out. And so it was kind of, and then I started seeing women that were in a really similar position. And kind of being that first generation of women too, as I call it, that were the generation where our mothering years and our perimenopausal years are in very close overlap, which is very different than I think a lot of the other previous generations, where that transition was a very distinct transition and you weren't at home with babies, less likely to be home with babies. And so it was kind of working through all of that, my own issues, and recognizing that there was a really big gap in not just the care that was available, but the information that was available. And so that kind of led me to just to have this interest in kind of specializing, I guess, but not as a specialty, but just as a special interest of this is who I want to help. And I think that my family's little expat move for a couple of years really facilitated me being able to take kind of what I was doing from a strictly one-on-one brick and mortar kind of practice to more of a virtual online one. That
That
was a long answer.
No, that's great. And to full disclosure on my end, one of the reasons that I kind of landed on your work, and one of the beauties of social media is that I was same space you were in. I was looking for, like, I know some changes in my body, and
Yeah.
I don't have any resources. And I lost my mom to cancer almost 3 years ago.
Wow.
And so it was one of those aha moments of going, well, shoot, we didn't have some of these conversations that we probably needed
Yeah.
to. And I was pretty young when she went through perimenopause and menopause. And all I remember hearing is all about the hot flashes. And I remember her not feeling like that she wasn't that young, maybe in her 50s, but she could have been more towards, like, almost towards the done end, if you will, and not
Yeah.
really understanding how early it can start. And so then when you start seeing these changes in your body, and similar to your experience, I kind of ask some of my providers, and they're like, wait, well, how old are you? And full disclosure, I'm 41. And so they're like, well, no, that feels a little early. Like, that's so yeah, being able to have those
Yeah.
resources available, or just being able to hold space for, if you see these changes happening in your body,
Yeah.
you're not crazy. It could be happening, your hormones could be shifting and shaking a little bit and
Yeah.
having some different things go on with you. I One of the things that I love about how you point out both in your Instagram lives and in even some of your newsletters is this question of, well, how do I know if I'm in perimenopause or not?
Yeah.
What's the test? And I love how you said in your live yesterday, we treat people, not test results,
Yeah.
but we're trained in a culture of like, well, if something's changing, like there's got to be evidence for that. There's got to be like, where's the hard scientific evidence that says at this age this happens, or this
Yeah.
lab will validate this. And so I wonder if you can just
Yeah.
start there and kind of dive into, how do we know if we're in perimenopause?
I'd love to. So perimenopause. So first, I think we should define that perimenopause is that kind of 2 to 10 year span that happens before menopause, and how long you're in it really depends on genetics, most likely, and probably some environmental things. Menopause is the one day that marks 12 months since your last period, and everything after that is postmenopause. So most women know when menopause is about to happen because they haven't had a period for 12 months, right? But perimenopause can be a little bit sneaky because it can happen as early as 35. The average is definitely more likely to be in your 40s, but it can happen, earlier. And there isn't a test. There is no blood test, saliva test, urine test, anything else that can say yes or no, because it is a diagnosis based on symptoms and age and family history. So, we always talk about asking your mother. So your mother's age at menopause is your best predictor. It's not 100%, but even just polling people in your family. So mother, aunt, older sisters, trying to get a sense, did they go into menopause early or late? Everything else is going to be a ballpark, but you can certainly get a sense of, are you more likely to be in your early 40s or your mid to later 50s? I worked with a family in Nova Scotia where all of the women had, like, there were four sisters, and they all had periods until their late 50s. And then two of the sisters had been born when their mother was 47 and 48. you
I can't
know?
imagine that. I'm ready to be done.
Yeah. So the
Wow.
first thing that I tell women to do is, as soon as you start having periods, and I tell this with my girls too, is, just track your cycles, because they are always going to be a really great barometer of not only period health, but just overall health. And so when you start to notice changes in your period, and for women in early perimenopause, that's often a shortening of your cycle. So if you had a 27, 28-day cycle, it may now be on average 24, 25, 26 days. So that shortening happens because our eggs are getting older. And the older that those eggs and follicles are, the less progesterone they produce. Less progesterone means a shorter second half of your cycle. And with that drop in progesterone, a lot of women can also experience anxiety, especially in the days like leading up to their period. They may start to notice some shifts in body temperature, especially again in the days leading up to their period. Also, some sleep changes. So these would all be some of the early signs and symptoms that you can see why they're so easily overlooked, because it's easy to think, oh, well, someone in their late 30s, especially if they have kids and they're juggling work and maybe other obligations, of course they're feeling anxious, of course they're not sleeping, if all of these things that we can just kind of attribute to life, for many women are life plus perimenopause. And so acknowledging that hormonal soup is changing makes them feel empowered, and also helps everyone to find the right tools so that they can cope and manage better.
Yes, and I've seen this a lot in this last year too, is that how much, not that it's not valid, but how much emphasis we're putting on it's, oh, because you're living in a pandemic. It's
Yeah.
because we have additional stress, which that's true. There's additional stress, and life definitely got a shakeup in this last year.
Yeah.
But for women that that just got added on top of what was already going to be happening in their bodies at that time.
Yeah.
But it's been my experience that people will again just pass off what they're feeling physically in their body as just related to the pandemic. And some of it
Yeah.
might be, but it doesn't mean that all of it is, especially if they're in that age group too.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Mhm.
But yeah, so testing, we don't really have any. There are lots of products on the market that, um, claim to measure hormones, and they do. I don't think there's any doubt that what they're measuring is a hormone. But the thing that I always tell people is, one, that test needs to determine, like, if someone's going to run a test, the litmus test should always be, is the result going to change how you're treated? And we can definitively say that with hormone tests for perimenopause, not for everything else, and often there are good reasons to run hormone tests, to exclude other things. But if we're strictly speaking about confirming that someone is in perimenopause or trying to determine what stage they're in, a test cannot tell us that, because our hormones shift so much just as part of the natural process, that the measurement that we get 1 month doesn't predict what happens the next month and doesn't tell us what happened the month before. It doesn't help us to decide what's the most appropriate treatment, because the treatment is going to depend on what symptoms someone is having. How I treat someone who's having hot flashes and anxiety is very different than how I treat someone who's having sleep changes and vaginal dryness. So, trying to use a test result to determine the best treatment isn't evidence-based. And we know that hormone levels don't correlate with symptoms. So that's the other thing. We're measuring something that doesn't have a clinical correlation to the symptom, and it doesn't help us to determine the treatment. So, and as far as I know, and I do regular kind of, dives into the literature and looking for studies, that hasn't changed. So just because we can measure something doesn't mean we should. And so always kind of question whether or not this test result is actually going to be meaningful to your treatment.
Right. And how it might also impact the anxiety that you're already maybe
Yeah.
experiencing related to the hormones. Many of my clients have felt this compulsion, like go down the rabbit holes of like, well, maybe it's this, well, maybe it's
Oh
this, well,
yeah.
maybe it's this. And that ends up exacerbating a lot of the mental health symptoms that are coming
Yeah.
as a part
So
of
much.
perimenopause, also. Yeah.
Because one of the things that I have seen, with people coming to me for like a second opinion, for example, is, people will come to me with 2 or 3 sets of some kind of testing, blood work, urine, saliva, and say, look, this was the first test and we did this, and then this was the second test and this changed, but this didn't. And then I tried harder and did more, and this was the third test, and why didn't it work? And so I feel terrible for them that, they had this burden that they were doing something wrong, when in fact it should never have been the test that they were looking to change. Right? It should have been like, let's try, I always talk about, try something on. If I make a suggestion to someone, or they say, should I try this, let's try it on. There's, unless there's harm, but most of the time, there's no harm in trying something on for a few weeks. You do have to be a bit more patient with hormones, because it can take 4 to 6 weeks for anything that we do to really kind of reach max effect. But we can try it on, and if it works and it's helping, great. If not, we move on. And that's really the only outcome that I'm worried about, is, how someone is feeling.
Right. And you've mentioned that the only one test that's out there is to kind of validate that menopause has happened. Can you speak a little bit
Exactly.
more about that?
Yeah, so that's follicle stimulating hormones. So we have what I call upstairs hormones, which come from the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the brain. And then we have the downstairs hormones, which primarily come from the ovaries and the adrenal glands. And so one of those upstairs hormones tells our ovaries to start growing follicles. And that happens on a, regular cycle, and that's kind of part of how we mature an egg. But the closer that we get to menopause and the fewer eggs that we have, I like to use the analogy that they're kind of like an older person who's starting to lose their hearing. So the ovaries can't hear as well, and the brain starts shouting louder. And eventually they have to shout so loud that, that we can measure this really high level. So when follicle stimulating hormone rises consistently above 25 or 30, depending where you live, we can then say that someone and they haven't had a period for 12 months, we can, say with quite a bit of certainty that that person is in menopause. But I have seen FSH fluctuations, all over the map within just a few months. Women, for example, who are going through fertility treatments, who might be in their late 30s or early 40s and are having FSH checked, fairly regularly. I've seen it go from 2 to 26 in the span of a month. right? And so, you can't rely on it in perimenopause at all. You can only rely on it to diagnose menopause under those conditions.
Well, and like you said, you're kind of combining the lab result plus the symptom of not having a period for a
Exactly.
year. And so you're
Yeah.
having both kind of validate each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's dive into a little bit about then the symptoms. Like if someone's feeling like their stuff is shifting, their hormones are shifting, they're having some of
Hmm.
these experiences around mood stuff, sleep stuff. Oh, we could even dive into the weight gain part. That's always the biggest
Yeah.
conundrum for so many. And so when women start experiencing that happening, and we're saying, well, there's nothing we can do to validate that with a blood test. What could we offer as here's some things to try on to
Yeah.
support any of these symptoms someone might be having?
Yeah, and so a lot of it depends on what stage they're in. So there are a few different kind of ages and stages of midlife. So the first is what we would call very early perimenopause. This is most likely to be someone who's in that kind of mid to late 30s, maybe even early 40s, who hasn't necessarily noticed changes in the length of their period, but maybe they're getting heavier. Maybe now they're getting headaches the day before, and that's new for them. Maybe PMS feels like it's worsening, or they've had those subtle changes in sleep and body temperature in the days leading up to. Those symptoms are very much due to that declining progesterone. And for those women, when I'm working with those women, I'm very much about trying to support progesterone. So there are some herbs, Vitex agnus, castus is one of them, chaste tree, that I would often use in combination with other things, because we're really just trying to support as many ovulations as we can until the end, right? Because ovulation in and of itself has value to our health. Every month that we ovulate, progesterone is a drop in the bucket of health. And, women feel their best when they have, natural progesterone circulating. So as many ovulations as we can extend, that's what we want to try and do. So, and then as they move into early menopause or early perimenopause, this is when they might start to notice that their periods are changing, but not by more than a few days. So, kind of less than 7-day changes from cycle to cycle, but maybe those symptoms that they were having in very early perimenopause are intensifying. That's often due to the fact that they're now in the kind of estrogen dominant or estrogen excess stage, where as our ovaries spotter towards the finish line, we start to churn out more follicles, and each of those follicles produces estrogen. So many months of perimenopause are spent in a high estrogen and low progesterone state. That typically is what causes most of the discomfort. That's when we really feel like our soup is so significantly changed, that we don't even recognize ourselves anymore. And that can be personality, that can be physical, that can be emotional. And for those women, I spend a lot of time focusing on trying to modulate that estrogen response. So, I'm a big fan of phytoestrogens, and I really like the evidence base behind them, but also my clinical experience with them and all of the other reasons that those phytoestrogen rich foods benefit women: protein, fiber, those kinds of things. But they really are the superstars of hormonal health, because they act as anti-estrogens in a high estrogen environment, but they can also help to top up low estrogen levels. So they really are a modulator of estrogen, and a very weak one at that. So they don't come with the side effects and concerns that we might have with other sources of estrogens, like hormone replacement therapy or something like that.
And what are
So
some of the phytoestrogen rich foods and herbs?
yeah, so the two food groups really would be, soy is the big one, and so soy's isoflavones are well known, and as I'm sure you know, lots of people have concerns about them. That I think most of the time we can reassure them that those concerns around breast cancer risk and thyroid concerns, generally aren't evidence based, or we don't have the research to support avoiding them by any means. But soy is a great one, and people can get a 50 milligram dose of isoflavones in just a serving a day. So it's a really nice way for people to get a regular dose of phytoestrogens by having a cup of soy milk instead of regular milk, cow's milk, if they choose to enjoy milk. Or maybe using tofu a few times a week instead of meat, or having edamame on the salad. Or so it's a really easy way. We can also get phytoestrogens from beans and lentils. So all beans and lentils have some, not in the same concentrations as soy. And then there's also flaxseed. So ground flaxseed is a great source of lignans, which is another type of phytoestrogen, which, again, acts a little bit different than the rest, seems to have some additional benefits potentially with prevention of hormone-sensitive cancers. It's a great source of fiber. So I encourage women to get a little bit of all of it. So you don't have to commit to one. You don't have to overdo one. If you don't like one, you don't have to have it. There's enough of a selection that, including ones that you enjoy several times a week, regularly is usually the way that I try and encourage people to use them.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I worked with your online course, so took your online course and test drove many of your recipes that you included with that. And I have to say, I have to give a shout out to the avocado brownies. Like,
So
those
good.
so good, and so many of those phytoestrogens included in them too. So yeah, we could tell people more about how to find that at the end today, but that is definitely a favorite in our household for sure. And then what about things that can help with say the mood stabilization, or would phytoestrogens also be helping with that? But things like mood, things like the weight gain, what are some of your
Yeah.
tips of the trade that you support women with those?
I love talking about mood because I think that there's a stereotype of the menopausal woman, right, as being hot and moody and cranky, and I think there's almost a stigma there too, that any woman who's over 40 and cranky, it's her hormones and she's kind of going through that phase of life. And so I really think that if we understand that there are changes in the brain that happen when estrogen and progesterone levels change, we actually do lose part of our filter. So we have this part of our brain called the amygdala, which is our emotional filter. And its job is to sense kind of feelings and thoughts around events and determine whether, is it a threat to my survival or not? And typically adults it can also engage the thinking part of their brain before that reaction kind of goes into full speed ahead. And the prefrontal cortex, that brain part, can say, oh, you know what, yeah, you don't have to worry about this, you don't have to freak out so much. Or, yeah, no, that's a 5-alarm event, you need to freak out. But when we lose that filter, because estrogen and progesterone levels are changing, it becomes very difficult to emotionally regulate. And it's an uncomfortable place to be for women because we think that we should have that sorted out by the time that we're adults and have been adulting for a long time, that we shouldn't get so worked up about something or shouldn't feel so emotional about something. So again, I like to normalize that there are actual changes in our brain that are happening on top of all of the other events of life, work and home and other things that could be, pulling and drawing on your ability to cope. So one is kind of teaching women about what's happening. So again, they at least have a sense of what's going on. So supporting those estrogen fluctuations, though, is key. So, in those perimenopausal years where your estrogen is going up and down, using phytoestrogens is always going to be an important part of that. There are also herbs that have phytoestrogen. So red clover is one of my favorites. And I use that quite often with women who are in that estrogen excess stage right through to the lower estrogen years. And there are herbs, that we can use that are a little bit more symptomatic. So, if women need more mood support or anxiety support, we can do that too. It doesn't have to be a treat the root and nothing else. I think that addressing the root is important, but we can also treat the branches. We can polish up the leaves while we're waiting, for the rest of the tree to take hold. So yeah, but definitely acknowledging those mood changes, that they're not crazy. And when I ask women, can you relate to meno-rage? Can you relate to that fire in your belly that makes you feel like your head's about to explode? Some of them are like, yes, why didn't anyone tell me about this before? you know?
Absolutely. I was just recently at my annual physical with my ND, and I was explaining, like sharing that exact thing with her. And like you said, feeling like you're not quite yourself in general. I'm a fairly
Yeah,
easy rolling, low key person. And I told her, I said, it's like my bullshit meter is working overtime. And
it's gone.
she's kind of in our same age group. She's like, that's not such a bad thing. I mean, given, everything that's gone on in the world and around like
Yeah,
media and social media and all that. I'm like, I know, but the grocery clerks really are nice people. I shouldn't get so bitchy with them. And so we just had this kind of this funny like back and forth around that's one of the gifts and superpowers that come within middle age is being
yeah,
able to notice bullshit and call it out. But how do we also like keep in some compassion within that so that
yeah,
we don't live in this space of constantly, like you said, feeling like our head's going to explode, and be especially
yeah,
when that feels so foreign to us. And so how do we like find this balance between like, yeah, you've lived long enough now that you don't have to take anyone else's crap, but
yeah,
how can you compassionately say, I'm not going to pay attention to your crap versus,
yeah.
really biting somebody's head off. And
And so, for me, when I really finally understood that my emotional filter, wasn't working, and that this, what we call the amygdala hijack, was happening on a regular basis, that my brain just took everything as a potential threat to my survival, right? And even just a little schedule change was enough to, make it freak out. So knowing that if I just took 5 deep breaths, that I could then engage my thinking part of my brain, engage that prefrontal cortex, and it would give me enough time to actually assess, like, is this deserving of my time and energy? That was really helpful to me. And so there's lots of times when I just leave the room, I just pause, I kind of say, okay, I have this, like, I feel the fire in my belly, but I'm going to just go take 5 breaths. And, oftentimes it's really shocking how quickly I can diffuse that hijack. And yeah,
yeah, I think one of the other things that's important around this time too is when we're feeling that upheaval and women are feeling that upheaval, I've seen it so often in my clients that this is when they want to go try a new diet. This is when they
oh
want to go try to
yeah,
like get back in control because they're seeing weight changes, they're seeing these mood shifts, and it
yeah,
may have played out similarly in other parts of their life too, where things feel like they're out of control, so let's go try to control the food. But in reality, and I think you've mentioned this in some of your posts and your newsletters and stuff too, that is the exact opposite of what we need to be doing during perimenopause. I mean, really any time in
yeah,
life. But if we're going to put ourselves in kind of a restrictive state with food and trying to like grasp onto this control, what is that doing for our emotional control center that is already
yeah,
kind of trying to go through these fluctuations from the hormone standpoint? And now we're going to try to manipulate food in our
yeah.
body and get in control. And the two, in my experience anyway, the two will just fight with each other. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both practice from a non-diet perspective, and really, have, I think, work hard to help people expand their relationship with food from one of being a strictly physical nourishment. It's all about macronutrients or nutritionism, to recognizing that food needs to be a source of pleasure, should be a source of pleasure, and especially in midlife. And, food I see as an opportunity to have a pleasurable experience multiple times a day. And why should I deny myself that, especially at this time in life? Because any source of pleasure is going to stimulate those pleasure neurotransmitters, whether that's dopamine. Serotonin is another one that really shifts with our hormones. So in periods of lower estrogen states, serotonin is low. So anything that we can do to see food as a source of holistic nourishment, mental, physical, emotional, is, I think, an opportunity that every woman deserves. And because so many of the women that I think are in midlife are either well indoctrinated into diet culture or newly indoctrinated into diet culture because they've noticed these body changes, giving them permission to really redefine and explore a new relationship with food is such a gift. So many of them say, I had no idea that I could live without being on a diet. I've been on a diet my whole life, and to give them the tools to be able to say, like, you can trust your body. It actually really knows what it wants. And it's just asking you to listen. Every time that you can't, start another diet because it just feels too much, that's your body saying, like, hey, this isn't working for me. Like, we need to find something different. We need to choose a different way. So yeah, so I think that for women in midlife, those body changes can be terrifying. I can certainly empathize and sympathize that, our bodies change dramatically and from at every stage. My 20-year-old self didn't look like my teen self. My mid-30s postpartum self didn't look like my pre-baby self. And now in my mid-40s, I have, kind of a new shape. And that's all normal because bodies are meant to change. And, especially for women in midlife, I think that there's this absolutely unnecessary societal pressure to resist aging. Men get better with age and women decline with age. And so there's this, that's the narrative. And so there's a fear around bodies changing. There's a fear around losing control. There's a fear around weight gain. There's a fear against wrinkles, like all of these body changes that are normal, that happen to every single one of us. So, as I said before, I just try and normalize a lot of those things. That 80% of women will notice body changes. Those body changes happen most likely for a reason. The change to a more kind of an abdominal pattern of weight gain means that tissue can actually produce a bit of estrogen, a specific type of estrogen that is protective. So estrone, which is kind of E1. And that little bit of estrogen is likely to protect us later as we go through menopause, protect our bones and our brain and our heart. That maybe we can actually have some gratitude for the changes that our body is doing completely on its own, on schedule, without us having to intervene.
Yeah,
But I get that it's hard.
Yeah, I appreciate that you said that how much that fear comes into play in this space in life. And what I'm
Yes.
finding too, it's this combination of fear and grief. There's grief
Yeah.
for saying goodbye to their younger body, whether that's looks wise or ability wise, or that they can't have any more kids now that they're shifting into this
Yeah.
space of where, the having babies time is up. And so
Yeah.
it's this dance between the fear side of things, the grief side of things, and just normalizing it. So many of my sessions with people, like, we sit in those spaces quite a bit of just acknowledging that fear is there. Why is that
Yeah.
fear there from these societal messages? Why is that grief there? Again, from societal messages, thinking that, well, you may not be backpacking and hiking and doing all these long bike rides anymore because, here you go, you're in midlife and aging, and that's not true. You may need to adapt
Yeah.
some things, but we can still keep living rich, vibrant lives. And so just holding space for all of those emotions that are coming up, as well as the physiological related emotions that are coming up, like you said, with understanding what's going on in the brain and everything, is just that's why I think it's fascinating to be in this age group and work in this age group too, because there's
Yeah.
so many different aspects of being a woman in midlife that need nourishing and that need support and need
Yeah.
community and camaraderie. And it's because it's a crazy ride in midlife for sure.
And I'm sure you see it too, but there's just so much, there's so much diet culture aimed at women in midlife. If there
Absolutely.
is one group that, diet culture knows will do anything, spend anything, pray to whatever God is out there, like, it's this group. And so there's so much, just that targeted messaging of, I have the answer, and all you have to do is, this, and this. And, for the most part, it's people's experiences that they're selling, right? So it's, that personalized experience of I did this and it worked for me. So I'm going to now share my experience with the world without realizing that what works for one person isn't going to work for everybody because it just doesn't work that way. And I
Absolutely.
think that there's, a lot of, there needs to be so much, I think, just, kind of careful respect for the information that's out there, because I think that people's experiences matter and I would never want to invalidate one person's experience. But there is so much misinformation that's directed at women in this age group that I'm sure you see it too, that by the time women come to us, they're like, I don't even know what's what anymore. I've had women say that they don't know that whether they should eat the apple or the carrot because they can't decide which one has more sugar. And so it's just so much misinformation. And so, yeah, I think that being able to, it's a privilege to work with women in this age group, and respecting that there's a great vulnerability there, that needs to be treated, with real information and not
Yes.
anecdotes. My favorite saying is that the plural of anecdote is not data. So, just because it works
That's
for one
great.
person doesn't mean that it's going to work for everyone. So,
Right. And in our space of social media and influencers and gurus, and that there is a free
yeah,
platform for them to share their experiences, again, not trying to devalue their experiences, but their experience doesn't work for everyone, nor does it always have scientific evidence backing it up
yeah,
too. And so just being cautious, because we're a vulnerable population, like you said, especially if they've
yeah,
had long histories of body shame and dieting, even from maybe when they were kiddo, like maybe when they started puberty, that's when they started to tell the messages that, your body is not okay. And so if they've continually gone through life of body changes, puberty, maybe pregnancy as well, and now they're in this next phase of body changes, and they've never been allowed to feel okay with their body changing. They have constantly been on this fix it mission
yeah,
their entire life. And so that's what makes this group also, like you said, so vulnerable to diet culture messages, because for a lot of them, they've been doing it since they were 8 or 9 years old. I mean, that's when I first started noticing that, oh, my body's bigger than my classmates or whatever. And
yeah,
even though I didn't, luckily very privileged that my parents didn't buy into that or didn't support that, but I still was around it in school and with friends and friends' parents' attitudes towards bodies. So when you tack that all together for 30 or 40 years of someone's life, there's a lot
yeah.
that's going on there. I'm wondering if, just as we head in towards the end of our time, if you can speak just briefly to what happens when a woman is going through this stage of life, and maybe they also have some other conditions like endometriosis or
Mhm.
PCOS. I've had a few clients come through my practice with those, and they're like, okay, well, how does all that perimenopause stuff affect me?
Yeah.
I'm a little bit different, and I'm wondering if you can speak to both of those.
Yeah. So endometriosis is an interesting one because it's actually something that I had as well. And, one of my very early symptoms of um, a return of endometriosis. So I had it in my teens and 20s, had surgery, was treated, had kids, thought that I was one of those lucky ones that, getting pregnant would fix my endometriosis. But then I started to develop a lot of significant pain with ovulation and kind of mid-cycle pain, which was new for me, which I found out afterwards was because of all the scar tissue that I have around my ovary from 20 years of endometriosis. So as my ovary swells every month, it's very uncomfortable and can cause a lot of pain. And for women who have endometriosis and often have endometriomas, which are the blood-filled cysts that can rupture, it can be very uncomfortable. So for a lot of women, that higher estrogen state of perimenopause will worsen existing symptoms, but can also trigger new presentations of endometriosis. So that is definitely something for women to look out for. And, so if you are experiencing that, it's definitely a good idea to talk to your care providers and come up with a plan, because, that higher estrogen state of early perimenopause can last for several years. So, you don't want to have to be in pain for a long time. But the good news is that, endometriosis is an estrogen responsive condition. So as you get closer to menopause and that estrogen level declines significantly, it's going to, that should take care of most of your typical kind of cyclical type pain. But it definitely is a consideration. PCOS is a little bit trickier because for a lot of women with PCOS, they don't have regular cycles. And they are already used to being in a higher estrogen, lower progesterone state. And then they also have the mix of some insulin resistance and some higher androgens like testosterone. So it can make it very difficult to pinpoint the earlier stages. That's kind of been my experience, is that oftentimes by the time that someone is diagnosed as being in perimenopause, we realize that they're probably well into it, just because it was difficult to know, are their cycles newly irregular or the same? If someone with PCOS doesn't have a cycle for 60 days, they usually have a heavy period. The same happens in perimenopause. So it can be a much more difficult that way. But that's been probably my main experience around it, has been that it's more difficult to diagnose.
And then how would, like, leaning on those phytoestrogen foods or herbs, how would those be beneficial or not at all to either of those
In the
conditions?
same way, and there's definitely, there's phytoestrogens across the board support estrogen balance. And so we see that in the epidemiological studies that have looked at cultures that, typically cultures that include a lot of phytoestrogens. Some of the earliest research on soy found that the most protective effect was if someone started consuming soy in their teens, likely because of that modulating effect that carried over their lifespan. We've seen studies where women who've had breast cancer have a reduced risk of recurrence if they are including phytoestrogen foods. Now, and these are observational studies. These aren't like RCTs where we take two groups and we say one eats phytoestrogens, one doesn't. This is, based on the last 5 years, well, from what you recall, so we always have to be cautious with that interpretation. But I think there's enough of those studies out there to say that for the most part, including phytoestrogen-rich foods benefits estrogen balance in most women throughout their age, all the ages and stages. So I don't really see a downside to it. There's also, like I said, some good evidence for soy with PCOS. And so I wouldn't see any concerns there. And because endometriosis is a higher estrogen condition, it is going to benefit in the same way that we would in those higher estrogen states of perimenopause.
Great. So some of that balancing, like you said, the
Yeah.
phytoestrogens are there to balance. Yeah. Which I think
Yeah.
I think you might be one of the first people that I've ever heard describe it that way, because again,
Okay.
I've just like I've heard from popular, media information
Yeah.
around like there's the anti-soy camp and then there's the soy
Yes.
camp, and I am of an age that when soy really first started coming on the popularity market and we were putting soy protein isolate in everything.
Everything.
And
Yeah.
it wasn't until I went to grad school and was learning about like Whole Foods culinary education and going, well, yeah, but those studies like you were referring to of like some of those other cultures, particularly Asian cultures, those studies aren't done on soy protein isolate. They're done on the whole
No.
food forms of soy. That's just what was part
Yeah.
of their diets. And so, like you said, being able to look at any of those other information that's out there about soy and looking
Yeah.
at it with a fine-tooth comb going, okay, are we talking about supplemental soy? Are we talking about
Yeah.
edamame? Are we talking
We're
about
talking about
tofu?
foods.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, whole foods. So soy milk, tofu, edamame, soybeans, tempeh, any of those are fine. And kind of my Coles Notes version, my elevator speech about soy is that it is between 1/200th and 1/1000th the strength of our own estrogen, depending on the receptor that it binds to. But it has an affinity for the beta receptor. And the beta receptor is the one that's associated with protection and reduced cancer risk. So because these phytoestrogens preferentially bind to this beta receptor, that means that they also reduce activity at the other receptor. So in the situation where your hormonal soup is swimming with estrogen, if you have these phytoestrogens that are binding to that beta receptor, you're going to have a slightly dampened estrogen response. if you have if you're in an estrogen desert, like you would be in the later stages, and you have your receptors are wide open, it can actually help to fill in some of the gaps, but it can never achieve a physiological effect above and beyond what your body would expect and want anyway. So, the idea that we need to fear it is definitely not evidence-based. And again, I have Google alerts set up for this. I regularly comb the research, and nothing new comes up. There's often a concern around thyroid function, but that's mitigated as long as we have a good source of iodine. So depending on where you live in the world, you might have to put a little bit more thought into that. But for the most part, soy is a very safe, and phytoestrogens in general are very safe and beneficial foods for everyone to include. So
Yeah. Yeah. Like I always say, it's hard to go wrong when we're talking about food. When we get into the world
exactly.
of supplementation,
Yeah,
there we may need to pay a little bit more closer attention. But our bodies are designed to function with food. They know what to do with it.
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
Jenn, this has been such a great conversation. I appreciate you diving into all these different angles. And I just know that so many of the women that are either part of the Savor Food and Body Facebook group, some of my clients, like I said, I continually mention your Instagram account to my clients to come and learn just about like how do we
Thank
debunk
you.
some of these myths. And so I really
Yeah.
appreciate you coming on today and pinpointing some of these specific spots that we can think about and consider as we go through midlife. And
Thank
where
you.
can people find more about you? And even if you want to tell a little bit about your course or what you have coming up too, that people could work with
Sure.
you on.
Thanks. Well, as I always say, Instagram's my one true love. So always find me there at menopause.nutritionist. And that's definitely where I engage the most. I love the community that's been created there of people who are looking for the type of information that I like to share. So, and I always say that I try and help women who are in their trying to make peace with their 40s and food and their hot flashes, so trying to understand what's happening, and so that they feel kind of empowered for the next season of life instead of kind of dreading it and fearing it. So which is the basis of my self-study course, the Thinking Woman's Guide to Menopause, which as is really based on helping women to figure out how can they write their own hormonal roadmap, how can you figure out symptoms to look for, ages and stages, treatment options that you should know about that you can discuss with your care provider, but then also some practical tools on developing that relationship with food that is going to nourish all those pieces of health. And kind of tips and tools for managing some of the conditions like anxiety and sleep changes and those kinds of things. So and then I have a new program coming out soon, which is called Beyond the Scale, and it is specifically for women over 40 who are trying to undiet their life. So they are done with dieting and they're looking for a chronic dieting recovery plan, and combined with an understanding of those midlife changes. And so that's coming later this spring.
I love the title of that, the living an
Thanks.
undiet life. That's and beyond the scale, living beyond the scale. I think that's fantastic. And I will put links to below the blog post. If folks are watching this on the alpinenutrition.org blog post, there will be links to Jenn's website. Is that the best place, Jenn, where they could go and learn about your course and get your courses on your website?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay. Great. All right.
Thank you
Well,
so much, Amanda.
thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to staying in touch with you on Instagram
Yeah,
also, and I hope our listeners do too. So thank you again.
thanks.